Today's webinar presentation is entitled Navigating Vermont Wetland Rules, Understanding Forestry and Silvicultural Allowed Use. Our presenter today is Shannon Morrison. Shannon is a graduate with a master's degree of science from the University of Vermont. She graduated in 1998. She has worked at the Department of Environmental Conservation since 1999 and as a district wetlands ecologist since 2000. As an expert in wetlands and Vermont wetland rules, she works to protect wetlands on projects ranging from large-scale wind projects to permitting single-family homes. Currently, Shannon covers Washington, Lamoille, Essex, Orleans, and Franklin counties. Welcome, Shannon, and I'll just go ahead and turn it over to you. Oh, actually, Shannon, before I turn things over to you, I just also wanted to recognize in joining Shannon at the National Life is also Gary Saborn, who many of you guys know. He is with the Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation and works as a watershed forester. So he may chime in at the end of the webinar to help address any questions as they come up.
Great, thank you. So good morning, everybody. Today my presentation is in three parts. First, I'll get into wetland identification a little bit, do an overview of the Vermont Wetland Rules, which is the state regulatory authority protecting wetlands, and then get into some details about the allowed uses surrounding silvicultural use. So wetland identification. This may be a shock to you all, but not all wetlands have cattails. They come in all different shapes and forms, and in the community that you're working in, we have quite a few wetland forested areas that you probably encounter quite regularly. In order to be a wetland, there needs to be three parameters present. One is hydric soils. So those soils that are wet for long enough to develop characteristics that are deemed wetland soils. Hydrophytic vegetation or water-loving vegetation. And hydrology, meaning you need to be wet for at least, or saturated to within 10 inches of the soil surface for at least 2 weeks out of the growing season to meet this criteria. Wetland soils come in a few shapes and forms. There's a high organic content type soil, which is peaty. When the soils are saturated for long enough, the organic material in the soil breaks down much slower. And then there's the more typical, very dark organic soil overlaying gray soil with mottles or orange spots. And hydric soils are mapped on the Vermont Atlas from NRCS. This is primarily an agricultural artifact, but it is a good way to kind of look for these soils in broad groups in the mapping programs. And you'll see these described, they'll show up as hydric soils, and there's really sort of a spectrum of how wet things are as they appear in the NRCS soil maps. So things like mucks are going to be on the very, very wet end of the scale, and then cavite silt loams, you'll find that those are coming up as hydric in the lower parts of the landscape, but maybe not in the upper parts of the landscape. So here's an example of some of the soils that you see on the mapping. These maps are available online in the Vermont Natural Resources Atlas and are a great tool. The brown is the mapped hydric soil. The green in the middle is the that's the Vermont Significant Wetland Inventory map, and this is a highlighted. The yellow is a highlighted hydric soil, and so when you pull that up, you'll find information about what that soil is. This one in particular is a peach and muck, and it gives you a really good description. Now, if muck's in the name, you can bet that it's a very, very wet soil. Whereas if you look at an adjacent soil, maybe this is a cavite silt loam, they're typically poorly drained, but you may only find that there's wetland in the lower part of the landscape here. Wetland soils on the ground, I think the easiest way to differentiate is looking at the colors. So non-hydric soils are well drained, they're bright orange and brown, and they're well oxygenated, meaning there's lots of porous soil that can have iron that's oxidized, and that's why you get the orange color. Non-hydric soils are those that are poorly drained. They tend to be black and gray or depleted browns, and that's because they're saturated, so the iron in the soil is reduced. A simple way to remember this is orange and yellow, happy fellow, black and gray, stay away. So if you're out in the field and you're comparing areas as you go down into the landscape, the soils on the left are nice and bright, soils on the right you start to see are darker, grayer, with a water table once you start digging holes. And these, you know, it ends up being a comparison, looking at something that's high up and you know is very well drained to areas that are lower down and appear, you know, to be substantially different. So those are some good examples. The other criteria is wetland plants. Basically, there's a list that goes through each plant that you can find in the Northeast and Vermont specifically and says what's the percentage in which this particular plant occurs in a wetland setting. So obligate plants, you find there's almost 99% in wetlands, so marsh marigold, royal fern, false nettle too is another one. And then facultative plants, it runs through a scale. You find these, you know, pretty good portions, 67% to 99, or yeah, 99%. And these are things like sensitive fern, facultative, things like ostrich fern, so about half the time in uplands, half the time in wetlands. And in order to meet the criteria, basically you have to have 50% of the plant community in these three categories, either obligate, facultative wet, or facultative. So wetland hydrology. As I mentioned before, you need to have inundation or saturation to within soil surface for at least 5% of growing season in most years. In Vermont, the growing season translates to about 5% is about 2 weeks out of the year where you're actually seeing plants grow. And because we can't go out and, you know, look at every day whether or not the soil is saturated, we look for indicators that are either primary or secondary. So primary examples of meeting the hydrology criteria include things like observation of soil, surface water, soil saturation, things like algal mat, oxidized root channels, and sometimes they smell like rotten eggs. And it's pretty funny when you take us out and we're out there sniffing soil, but that is one of the criteria. The secondary indicator includes drainage patterns, stunted or stressed plants, or geomorphic position in the landscape, so adjacent or at the bottom of a basin can often be an indicator. So primary indicators, if you're standing in water, it's likely that you meet that criteria, especially if there's evidence that that water sticks around for a while. And then soil saturation, you dig a hole and basically look at the capillary action in the soil to see how far that water rises up in that soil horizon. Things like drift lines and water stains on trees are things that you'll see in the landscape indicating a frequent flooding regime. And water stained leaves in shallow rooting systems. The former is, you know, evidence of flooding, and the other one is evidence that either there's not a whole lot of, you know, if it's close to bedrock, you'll see this, but oftentimes you'll see this in wetlands as well. And tree tip overs are another indicator of shallow rooting system and something you see quite frequently in wet forest lands. So that's sort of the intro to what is a wetland, and I'm not sure if anybody has any specific questions about that. Kate, do you have any questions coming in?
Yeah, there are no questions at this time. Just a reminder to folks, if you do have a question, please feel free to use the question function on your control panel. Just go ahead and type it in, and then I will feed those questions to Shannon.
Great, thank you. So the next section is about the Vermont Wetland Rules. The rules were originally passed in 1990. There was a major rule revision in 2010, and the wetlands basically take jurisdiction, or excuse me, the rules basically take jurisdiction over wetlands with significant function and value. So the function and values that we're interested in protecting through the Vermont wetland rules range from stormwater and flood protection and water quality protection, which are two of the major ones, to fish habitat, wildlife habitat, exemplary natural communities, endangered and rare species, and then some of the values are education and research, recreation and economics, open space and aesthetics, and then the function of erosion control. We have a classification system that we use in Vermont, and it's based on an evaluation of the extent to which the wetland provides functions and values. So it's the lens in which we kind of look at wetlands and whether or not they have the functions that we are looking to protect. Class 1 wetlands are the highest category of protection. These are exceptional and irreplaceable in their contribution to Vermont's natural heritage. There's only 3 of those in the state right now. So the meat and potatoes of really what we're doing in terms of protection lie within the Class 2 wetlands. You only have to have one function to be significant enough to be protected using the Vermont wetland rules. And we look at these wetlands not only on their own, but also in conjunction with other wetlands, and a lot of this is based on sort of their position in the landscape as well. And then Class 3 wetlands, there's a nice circular reference here that they're neither Class 1 or Class 2 wetlands. And basically these are wetlands that I would describe as, not having a whole lot of function that merits protection. It could be that they're very small. It could be that they're in a landscape position or managed in such a way that they don't really have the function and value that we look for. So in 2010, our rules changed, but prior to that, from 1990, basically any wetland that appeared on the Vermont Significant Wetland Inventory map, which is a offshoot of the National Wetland Inventory Mapping Project, was considered protected in Class 2. So on a map, you would see these green polygons here, or sort of aqua polygons. Those are the VSWI maps. Now, not only are those protected, but any wetland adjacent or contiguous to those VSWI mapped wetlands are also considered significant. This is mainly due to the fact that these maps were made from aerial photos taken at a 1 to 80,000 scale, and they're in no way accurate. So any sort of evaluation of wetlands requires ground proofing to determine where the actual wetland is and where those boundaries are. So in this case, if all of these lighter green polygons were actually mapped wetlands, because they're connected or touching this VSWI, those would also be considered significant. This still holds true after the 2010 map change, but in addition, the 4.6 section of the rules basically say that if you look like what's on the VSWI map, then you're also considered significant, and that translates to if you're over a ½ acre in size or larger, you're considered significant. If you're under a ½ acre in size and you're adjacent to a stream, lake, pond, or river, or you're a vernal pool, or there's a special and unique wetlands like bogs or fens that would meet the exemplary natural community criteria, or it's the wetlands at headwater above 2,500 feet in elevation, or the wetland is adjacent to an impaired water and so has significant function as related to water quality. All of these are also considered Class 2 and significant under this Section 4.6 presumption. So this really changes the landscape in terms of what we're taking jurisdiction over. It means that the due diligence, as always, has been on the applicant or the land use participant to determine whether or not A, there is a wetland, and B, whether or not this is a significant wetland. We routinely go out on site visits to help make those determinations. So the wetland itself is protected, and also a buffer zone around the wetland is protected. So the buffer zone is defined as an area of upland around the wetland. For Class 2 wetlands, that area is 50 feet from the boundary of the wetland. And for Class 1 wetlands, that is 100 feet from the boundary of the wetland. The buffer zone is really quite functional in that it provides its own level of water quality and wildlife habitat. And so that is something that the state of Vermont has decided to regulate. So the question always comes down to, once you've determined that you have a wetland and that it is Class 2, is whether or not a permit is required for the activity that's proposed. So activities that occur in Class 1 or 2 wetlands or buffer zones and are not considered an allowed use require a permit, especially if there is grading, filling, ditching, or dredging. There's removal of vegetation such as tree cutting or conversion that's outside of the silvicultural practice. And then the construction of buildings, roads, buried utilities, or infrastructure. Things that don't require a permit are activities that occur in Class 3 wetlands, although there may be federal or other state regulations that look at those activities and regulate them. There is no activity proposed in a Class 2 wetland or Class 1 wetland or buffer, meaning the project was able to stay outside of those limits. Or if the activity qualifies as an allowed use, it may not need a permit. In terms of permit criteria, the big push from us is avoidance and minimization. So we work with applicants regularly to get them out of the wetland or to get impacts down to a minimal size. So the applicant must demonstrate that there's no other way to do their project that avoids wetland and buffer zone impacts. They must use project design to avoid impacts to wetlands, buffers, and their functions and values to the greatest extent possible. And if the project is large enough, sometimes they must offset potential impacts if they're unavoidable. So here's a good example of impacts being avoided: directional drilling underneath a wetland and stream, for example, for a pipeline. And then the permitting criteria, the standards that we hold everybody to, basically the burden of proof is on the applicant to demonstrate the project will have no undue adverse impacts on the functions and values, both as a result of the initial impacts to the wetland and buffer zone and the cumulative and ongoing impacts from the project and the proposed land use. So I think that sort of concludes the wetland rule overview. I'm not seeing any questions, so I'm going to move on because I think this is kind of the section that everybody's really interested in, is the allowed use section. So in general, the allowed uses cover low impact activities, land use activities, including silviculture and agriculture, and maintaining existing structures and infrastructure. Allowed uses are only considered that where the configuration of the wetland's outlet or flow of water into or out of the wetland is not altered, and there is no draining, dredging, filling, grading in the wetland or buffer zone. And that applies in general, and then there's some specific call-outs where there can be exceptions to that draining, dredging, filling, grading rule for some specific silvicultural activities, things like operation of the existing hydroelectric facilities, routine repair of maintenance and utility poles, existing structures, emergency repair, things like pond maintenance. Obviously you need to get into the wetland and dredge, wildlife and fisheries management and beaver dam removal, duck blinds, catwalks, and docks, new overhead lines. And I would say the thing that's really different in those from the original rules to the 2010 rules is that there's best management practices associated with those allowed uses in many cases. And in the case of silviculture, we have the AMPs as well. So silvicultural allowed uses, we have a very strict sort of ongoing land use definition that applies to whether or not your activity, your forestry activity, would be considered an allowed use. So in our definition, it means that those activities are associated with the sustained management of land for silvicultural purposes, including the planting, harvesting, and removal of trees. And the real important part of this is recognizing this is sustained management. So it may not be considered an allowed use, even if you're following the AMPs, if you're clearing for a building site, if there's clearing for new utility corridors, if somebody wants to clear for views, or even sometimes airport clearance zones. If you're clearing for agricultural conversion in wetlands, that's also not considered an allowed use. And basically, you're clearing for anything other than the harvesting of trees in order to allow them to grow up again and to harvest later on. So the specifics for the silviculture allowed uses in section 6.1 through section 6.05 of the Vermont Wetland Rules are that they comply with the acceptable management practices as put out by the Department of Forest, Parks, and Rec. They comply with standards for deer wintering yards. They restrict maintenance and materials to log landings. They restrict log landings to uplands and buffers unless in frozen condition. The restoration of existing haul roads, I think we call those truck roads now, you're allowed to restore those and maintain those, and there's a one-time upgrade of 20%. And Gary and I had a discussion earlier about truck roads, and really those are the constructed roads, meaning there's actual gravel, fill, culverts, all of those types of things. So if you're building a new haul road, those are allowed use if they occur in the buffer zone. And in terms of maintaining your general forestry infrastructure, the removal of beaver dams is allowed in order to conduct your forestry activity. And if anything's occurring in a class 1 wetland or class 2 wetlands with RTE, with rare, threatened, and endangered species, there's supposed to be written and approved plans for those from the Department of the Secretary of Forest, Parks, and Rec. So things that aren't considered an allowed use. Basically, if you're out of compliance with your AMPs and you've had an activity that results in sedimentation, we would consider that fill, and that would not comply with our rules. If you are conducting your activity in a way where there's excessive rutting through the wetland, where there's dredging, draining, and changing flow in water, that's something that we would also not consider an allowed use and would be a violation of our rules. Leaving in excessive brush or fill that would either inhibit regrowth, meaning the fill changed both the flow of water and didn't allow for other vegetation to grow up underneath it, that would be considered a violation. New haul roads in wetland would be considered not an allowed use. Upgrading skid trails to haul roads would also require a permit. And using and upgrading infrastructure for non-silvicultural activity does not meet with the allowed use. So things like you have a skid trail that you want to upgrade and make a year-round access for the VASA folks or the VAST folks. That would not be considered an allowed use. So here's an example of excessive rutting that probably has done quite a job changing the flow of water in and out of the wetland. And here's an example of excessive brush left in that needed to be removed in order to comply with our rules. So let's get into some specifics. Log landings, what's considered an allowed use? If you locate it in the buffer, yes. If you located it in the buffer and then end up pushing material out of the landing into the wetland, that would be a no. If you locate it in the wetland in frozen conditions, that's considered a yes. If you use fill in frozen conditions that you don't then remove, that would need a permit. Fill in wetlands. If you leave the brush, slash, or debris in substantial amounts that it's considered fill in the wetland, that's something that would also be in violation. And then if you place the landing in wetland when it's not frozen or, you know, semi-frozen where it's impacting the ground, that's also something that's not considered an allowed use. So haul roads, truck roads, those that are actually built up infrastructure involving fill, culverts, all of those things that you need to actually use for trucks. If you locate it in the buffer, that's considered an allowed use. If it's new and you locate it in the wetland, that's something that needs a permit. If you locate it in the buffer and then use it for an activity other than silviculture, that's something that requires a permit. A lot of times we will get something in that says, oh, this is a silvicultural road that magically turns into a residential road, and this allowed use is really only surrounding the sustained use of silviculture. So the existing, if you have an existing haul road, you can maintain it and upgrade it one time by 20%. If you widen it more than 20% or widen it in subsequent years so that it adds up to more than 20%, then that's something that would require permits. Skid trails, what is considered allowed use? If you can locate those both in the wetland and the buffer zone. If you have to do substantial grading, filling, or dredging to create the skid trail, or your skid trail results in substantial dredging, that's something that is not considered allowed use. So if you have excessive rutting from the activity, that could be considered a violation. Use of acceptable management practices such as brush and slash to avoid rutting, that is considered allowed, but if you leave the material in at such a density that it constitutes fill, meaning it inhibits growth and or changes the hydrology of the wetland, then that's something that we would take jurisdiction over. And then the use of AMPs for water passage and erosion protection is also something that's considered an allowed use. With that, our recommendations are that you identify wetlands prior to starting the operation so that you know the resources that you're dealing with and can plan accordingly. You avoid and minimize those crossings through the wetland, so asking whether or not there's another way around or what the shortest distance is. The timing of your activity is going to help you. So if there's a possibility of using frozen conditions, if snowpack were possible for access to and through the wetlands, that's recommended. You can use brush or other temporary access to avoid rutting, but at the close of the job, any excessive brush and debris in wetlands should be removed. The grading out ruts to prevent changes in hydrology long term should be employed, and basically, you know, just kind of being smart about it. Now, in terms of forest practices, I've included some slides on some other allowed uses because I know that these are often co-located, And in terms of using existing trails, skid trails, logging roads, snowmobiling actually is considered allowed use on designated vast trails. But creating new trails or upgrading existing trails or roads for that use that involves fill, drain, dredge, or grading is not considered an allowed use. And I had a pretty substantial violation up in the Northeast Kingdom a couple of years ago that cost that snowmobiling community quite a bit of money to get that permitted. Things like the maintenance and repair of existing structures. So as long as the current structure is in compliance with the Vermont Wetland rules, it's something that you can maintain and repair. If it's not in compliance, it may need to come in for an after-the-fact permit or be restored. And if the activity does not result in substantial expansion or modification in the wetland or buffer zone, that's also considered an allowed use. So if there's excessive fill or dredging, draining, grading, or the existing infrastructure is located in a different place, those types of things also require permits. Fish and wildlife activities and beaver removal. We do have a beaver best management practice that is kind of co-housed with the Fish and Wildlife Department, and that information is available. And it basically says that you can remove dams if they're a threat to infrastructure or public or private property, but if they're just sort of out doing their thing and there's no threat to them and somebody just doesn't like them, that's not considered an allowed use. There's a timeline on new beaver activity that can be managed, and you can remove both beaver and dams as long as you talk with Fish and Wildlife if they're less than 2 years old without a whole lot of hassle. If it's a dam or an activity that's been around for a while, then you may need to get special permission, and there's special caveats for the silvicultural activity because we realize that that activity occurs over a longer time scale. And in the removal of dams across the board, it needs to be done in a way that doesn't impair water quality, meaning the water is lowered no more than a foot a day and in a manner that doesn't result in discharge to waters of the state. So no dynamite. Section 6.16, catwalks, docks, footbridges, basically low impact activities like trails. These are often co-located, in areas that are used for silviculture, for forestry, and these types of structures are also considered an allowed use. So you can construct these as long as they allow water to flow under and through. But anything that requires, those magical activities may require permits from our office. And basically, these structures, we want them to allow light to penetrate through, wildlife passage, and not involve heavy equipment to access or install. And then restoration, is this considered an allowed use? It is. Restoration of stream or wetlands. Oftentimes it requires plans to be signed by a wetland coordinator and reviewed, and we realize that this can also be an activity that's involved in the landscapes you guys are working in. And then trail building and maintenance. Basically it's the same sort of avoidance and minimization that we're looking for there. Okay, so I am going to leave the rest of the time for questions, but before I do, wanted to just note that a lot of this information, all of this information is really located on our website. We have a great website with all of the BMPs, the wetland rules, access to wetland mapping, access to information that you can hand out, including a fact sheet that Gary actually has here on logging activities in wetlands. That's a nice thing to kind of carry out with you as a quick reminder of things that meet that allowed use and things that may not meet that allowed use. So I'm open for questions.
Great, thanks, Shannon. So as we wait for questions to roll in, we did receive a question before the webinar began around the 20% rule. Could you just explain that rule a little bit more? What is allowed for improvement
Sure.
of that rule, and is it 20% widening of a road? Can you just explain that rule a little bit more, or that allowed use?
Yes. So this rule is specific only to truck roads or haul roads. Meaning that these actually have a structure, and Gary and I talked about this before today's webinar, and those are really not for, those upgraded winter roads or areas where there's corduroy, but actual structured roads that are around for a while. So in all cases, we're really looking at the footprint of what's on the ground. So if you had a 12-foot wide or a 10-foot wide road, you could improve it in a way that widened it to a 12-foot wide road, shoulder to shoulder, fill to fill, without having to, at one time, without having to go through a permitting process. In terms of maintaining existing structures, we would consider resurfacing a road that had previously been surfaced and allowed use. But if you're looking at, we have a lot of sort of sketchy roads that don't really have subbase, that don't really have a whole lot of form or substance to them other than that they've been traveled on, those may require permits. And we realize that there's sort of a spectrum of activity or infrastructure out there, and at some point we may need to look at it and say, no, I don't think that this is, what you're planning doesn't really fit into what this existing structure looks like right now.
Great, thanks, Shannon. Just to clarify and make sure folks are aware, if you have any questions, you can type them into the question box. That's part of your control panel. If for some reason you don't see a question box, there you can go up to View, and that'll bring you up to a drop-down menu. Just make sure that the questions feature is checked. It looks like we have a few more questions rolling in, so let me just read these here. Okay. The first question is, could you share again your website address?
Oh, sure. That's a great question. Let me just get out of here. And this is going to bring up. So our website is www.vtwaterquality.org and /wetlands.htm.
Great. I think I went ahead and just sent that into the system. Great. I'm not sure if that showed up for folks or not, but if you just leave that page up just for another second, that'll allow folks time to jot it down. Another question for you: how much grading is allowable when building or maintaining a skid road in a wetland buffer? Installing AMPs often requires smoothing and installing water bars, which could be considered grading.
Right. That is considered an allowed use as long as the other criteria around avoidance and minimization occur. So we understand that putting in a water bar in order to support a skid trail is something that that needs to happen. The preference on the grade or on the grading is that most of that occurs outside of the wetland in order to maintain hydrology through the wetland. Gary, do you want to talk about that anymore?
Thank you, Paul, for that question. Just the only thing that I could add is that I agree with Shannon that grading for the purposes of implementing the EMPs is allowable within the wetland, and landings are allowed also within the buffer of the wetland, but there certainly is grading there in cases where there are landings. But I think for the most part, most loggers probably will put their landings beyond the buffer. Skid trails going through wetlands, for the most part, wetlands are pretty flat anyways, so there wouldn't be, chances are there wouldn't be water bars that would be put in across the wetland, but they may be brushed in or corridored in. Shannon touched upon that. After logging, corridor or brush needs to be removed back down to grade. Any stuff that's been hammered into the wetland, we kind of come to an agreement that trying to remove that would really cause more harm than good. So leaving that in place and remove the excessive corridor or brush anything that's elevated above the natural elevation of the wetland.
And I just wanted to, I brought up this since I have your control of your screens. This is our sort of quick and dirty cheat sheet, and Gary actually has it in front of him right now, so you can see that it's useful. But this is a good one to sort of bring out with you to print it out, put it in your pocket, save it on your smartphone, whatever you want to do. That gives you just the real basics of sort of the easier questions that you might have.
Great, thanks, Shannon. And again, just for folks so that they know, that handout is available on your website at the www.vtwaterquality.org. Is it available as a PDF as well?
Yes, this is a PDF.
Great. We'll just give it another minute or so. If folks have any additional questions, this is your opportunity to put them in front of Shannon and Gary as well. So we'll just give it another minute and see if there are any additional questions coming in. Shannon, as one of my questions is, where do people get started? If folks have questions or, are wondering whether or not their project qualifies for this allowed use, where do they go? Do they go directly to you, or do they go to Gary? How do you recommend folks?
Well, I think that we've had some trainings with the folks in Gary's division, and so I imagine that everybody has a working relationship with their county foresters, and that's always a great place to start. But if it gets into the specifics of, it looks like we do have a wetland, it looks like we're not able to avoid it, it looks like we're going to need permits to get through here, or we'd like some information, or I got called out this summer on a project where there was a road underwater from a beaver dam, and that's been a head scratcher. Please give one of your district wetlands ecologists a call, and we're happy to come out. I go out on forestry projects quite a bit, given that I cover the Northeast Kingdom, and that's part of the job that we do, and the service that we provide is to answer those questions. And you can find us We're pretty much separated by counties. As you can see, I'm staging a coup. I'm basically taking over the state here. But we're down one person right now, so we're a little understaffed. But we are available for that type of site visit.
Great. A few more questions that just came in. How about mowing? Is mowing of alder in a wetland, does that require a permit if it's for wildlife habitat, or would it is it just for clearing or reclamation of land?
Well, we would consider taking out alder in most circumstances something that would require permitting, because that's a pretty substantial change in the landscape. It's a little bit of a gray area given, some agricultural practices, but if it's a specific for wildlife management, it's something that would need to come in with a wildlife management plan for approval. I haven't seen very many of those, and the ones that I've seen have come from the Department of Fish and Wildlife for either restoration project or habitat reclamation projects. In all other cases, that would require permits from our office.
Okay, great. And how about, is there a link to view a wetland permit?
Yes, there are lots of links around wetland permitting, and basically, let's see, the regulatory part. We have a link to the Vermont Wetland Rules. We have two types of permits, either a general permit or an individual permit. The general permits, it's basically the same application form right now, and there's some checklists, there's some instructions. Most of the time we find that people need consultants to help them work on these types of things. A lot of the information is pretty technical. You do need to have a full wetland delineation in order to apply for a permit. That information needs to be on a map so that you can calculate the amount of impacts. There are fees associated with the permit, so it's 25 cents per square foot of buffer zone impact, 75 cents per square foot of wetland impact, plus a $225 fee on top of that, and that's before you get into the wetland consulting and what that might cost. And there's also an after the fact, meaning if you have a violation and you want some part of that permitted, then that's something that costs more. So it's double the cost for an after the fact permit.
Okay, and again, all that information is available on your website.
It sure is. And since I have you, and it seems like there's no other questions, I just wanted to show you that there is a link to our Vermont wetland inventory maps. That's a really great way to do some project planning for yourself before you even get out to the site. Just kind of zoom in here. So as you kind of zoom in, all these project stars represent basically areas that we've been, and there's all kinds of good information on here. It takes a moment to boot up, but basically you have things like you can access the hydric soil layers, you can access different imagery, you can look at the VSWI maps, which are in the aqua here. You can identify the hydric soils. These red are floodplain areas. And you can actually print a really nice map off of here as well. Now, forested wetlands, especially those wetlands that are under evergreen cover, don't show up very well in the hydric soil mapping, or excuse me, in the VSWI mapping, so that's something to keep in mind. But you will see some pretty good soil maps for those areas that may be a better indicator. But this is a great tool and available to anybody who wants to use it. So
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that tool, Shannon.
sure.
That is a really great tool and a great way for folks to see if their project is going to impact the wetland, as when they're in the planning phases. So great. Thanks for sharing that. And that tool is available off of your website as well, or is there a separate URL?
This is available. The easiest link is off of our website because it'll just take you right there. But anrmaps.vermont.gov is basically where you're going to find all the interactive GIS mapping for the agency.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that, and I don't see any other questions coming in, so I just want to thank you so much for your presentation this morning. A lot of great information you shared, and we appreciate you taking the time to walk us through not only what a wetland is, but the silvicultural allowed use as well, and all the rules associated with doing forestry in and around wetlands. So thank you so much for your time this morning. Just a reminder for folks, this is part of a series. Our next webinar is scheduled for December 16th, and that webinar will be on managing with invasive plants in mind. We'll be joined by Elizabeth Spinney from Department of Forest Parks and Recreation, and she'll be talking to us about her work with invasive plants and giving some tips on thinking about invasives while we're managing the forests. So, and then lastly, just another quick reminder that and a plug for the survey at the end of this webinar. I ask that you just take a few minutes. It's a quick 5-question survey. Please take a minute just to fill out the survey and let us know other topics or give us some feedback on the session today. So with that, thank you again, everybody, for your attention this morning, and have a great day. Thanks all.